all looked like one another. Even the war had started to stop feeling real, and that made me sad. I felt untethered. Although I had a general sense of unease, a good part of that day in the bush was actually quite nice. John, Elizabeth, and Joshua were happy, and the sun was shining, which felt good on my skin, and Bob was so kind and friendly. When the sun went down though, and the winter air started to chill, any happiness left me. There is no summer or winter in the south of Sudan. There is only the hot wet and the hot dry. The first real winter night I'd ever experienced was in the Blue Mountains, and it was a freezing one. I was unaccustomed to being inside a building, but in the Blue Mountains, I couldn't go outside either, because when I did, my skin would feel like it was starting to burn. I had never in my life been cold before, let alone that cold. When I woke and rose, it was possibly even colder than when I'd gone to bed. There was frost underfoot, and as I walked around Bob's yard, it crunched. I had never seen ice before, and I hated it. The cold was my enemy. I hated the way it stopped my mouth from working and turned my breath into smoke. It was all so unnatural. That morning, if I could have clicked my fingers and been transported back to Kakuma or even Nottingham, I would have done it without a thought. I told John how I felt. He was angry, as I knew he would be, but also compassionate, as I knew he would be. After all, the cold was a shock to him too. The next day, John and I tried to register with Centrelink, the Australian Social Security Service, and we found that they were not well set up for African refugees. As a minor, I would need a legal guardian in Australia, which was a strange concept for me because the closest I had had to a guardian since the age of 7 were superior officers from the SPLA. For my brother to be my guardian, he and I had to have the same surname, or at least a good reason why we didn't. Thinkable naming convention was apparently not a good reason. John's full name was John Mark Akwek. So for us to register with the refugee papers that we had been given in Kenya, I had to take on John's surname. When I was given my Centrelink accreditation, I found a name on the form that meant absolutely nothing to me and bore no similarity to the names my family gave me, nor any mention of my clan's history. When we got back to the apartment, I voiced forcefully my displeasure in having to change my name. John was ever the pragmatist, though. Who cares what those people call you? You will always be Deng. But this is not my name. This is nobody's name, and it means nothing, I told John, holding up my Centrelink ID bearing the name Dave Machakwek. If Dave Machakwek gets to eat food and go to school, then I would want to be him. Just a few days later, Dave Machakwek was enrolled to be a student at Evans High School. I turned up that freezing morning at the high school confused and suffered silently through literature, mathematics, and human biology classes. I spoke to no students, understood nothing that the teachers said, and yearned for the day to end. I was 15 then, and that was the first day of traditional schooling I had ever done. It was not what I had expected. When I got home, I told John I could not do another day like that. I told my brother I would have rather been tortured than sit in those classes while the white people stared and the teachers droned on in what to me sounded like gibberish. I told John I was still angry at being called Dave too, and would no longer answer to that name. John knew I was adamant. This was not just teenage discontent. John could be a hard man, but he did not lack compassion either. He told me he would make sure that I could change my name back, and he realized that they were not going to teach me what I really needed to learn at Evans High School. At Evans High School, they were decorating rooms, but I still needed to build the foundation. I needed to learn English. I didn't go back to Evans High School. I didn't want to go outside at all, really. I didn't even know how to cross the road. And I would get looks everywhere I went. So I spent most of the first couple of weeks in Australia sitting on the floor with Joshua, watching a television show, a rare luxury in Kakuma, with 4 men wearing skivvies and singing simple, catchy songs. It turned out I didn't have to leave the house to get myself into trouble, though. When we first got to the apartment, one of the Marists explained how everything therein worked. When they got to the microwave, they explained it to John and me as a box that heats food up. Like a fire, right? I understood that. The Marists delivered some groceries for us, including cans of Coca-Cola, which they put in the fridge. I decided that I'd have one of the cans. Having never had a cold drink before, I decided to warm the can up in the box that heats up food. The can exploded in the microwave, of course, but not before creating a terrifying, localized electrical storm of lightning and sound that I thought would destroy the apartment. I was scared of the microwave after that, and felt like an idiot, until Elizabeth did the exact same thing a couple of weeks later. After a few idle weeks of staying in the apartment and playing with Josh, John arranged for me to start on an intensive English course at Blacktown TAFE. That first day at TAFE was really my first day as a student. When I sat down in class, I was confused, because I thought all of the people were white and I had assumed that all white people were able to speak English. It turned out that not all white people could speak English, and also that a lot of people in that class were not white at all, but were Indian or Southeast Asian. They had all looked like Kawaja to me. Most of the people at the course were as lacking in English language skills as I was. So I had finally found a place in Australia that didn't confuse me. A place where I fitted in. We were all learning together, like all of us boys getting our military training in Nottingham. As I managed to get a penciled hand around my first English letters and my mouth around some single-syllabled words, I started to feel achievement. I would think often about being back in my village when Adut the stammerer told me I had to go to Ethiopia to get an education. Now, 10 or so years later, I was actually getting an education. It felt good. I would study every night with John, showing him my workbooks and getting him to elaborate on my answers and place the words I had learned into a context I understood. I pretended as though my TAFE work was a chore, but the truth was it was the one thing I was enjoying in Australia. I would never tell John that, though. I thought he was trying to make me a soft family man, and for some reason, I felt like I needed to keep the edge I'd gotten as a soldier. I don't know why. I think a part of me was still harboring the possibility of getting my AK-47 back and getting involved in the war again. The war was still deep inside of me. I barely slept when I got to Australia, because when I did sleep, I would have vivid and dynamic Sudanese nightmares. Sometimes I would be back assaulting Capoeira or running from the bombs, but often the nightmares would be less literal, with me being pursued by something I couldn't quite discern or manically running to find something that I'd lost. The two themes in my nightmares were running and an electric fear of something worse than death. Often I would wake up somewhere other than my bed, having run into a wall or some furniture. My insomnia would spur me to ask for more and more TAFE work. During the day, it was easier to fill my head with television and school and play with my nephew. But at night, in the dark, my head would only go to the bad places, places that were only slightly better than the places I went to when I was asleep. On Sundays, John would make me go to church with Bob and Elizabeth, but I wasn't one for sitting down for long periods of time while being lectured in a language I didn't understand. The people there were very nice and welcoming though, and I made my first Australian friend there. That man's name was Jeff Hitchison, a large retired police detective who used to work out of Blacktown Local Area Command. The first time I went to church, Jeff bounded up to us, introduced himself and his family. Jeff had 2 sons, Paul and Ian, who were roughly the same age as me, and a wife, Margaret, just as kind as he, and he started talking to me. Even though I couldn't understand a word he was saying, the smiles and greetings spoke a universal language of kindness. I loved being in Jeff's presence. Partly through mime, partly through broken English, Jeff asked me what kind of things I liked to do, and I told him that I liked to play soccer. Jeff grabbed that information with both hands, arranging for me to start football training with his son, Paul. He would pick me up from the apartment before training and drop me off as well. And more often than not, he would arrange a meal afterwards that my stomach would be able to handle, and he did it all wholly through the kindness of his heart. The war I'd left seemed like such a large thing, and the charity of a churchman and his football-playing son a small thing by comparison. But Jeff's kindness was an integral part of my integration into Australian society. There are few things in this world that are genuinely ubiquitous, but it's true of football. While I understood almost no aspects of Australian life, I understood the goals and the ball and the offside rule and the joy of scoring in the exact same way every Australian player did. Paul was an excellent soccer player. When I started training with him, I had a game that had some raw usefulness but little polish. I was very fast though, and fit, and soon I was training with Paul's excellent club side, the Fairfield Bulls. Our coach was a man named Marshall Soper, a former Socceroos player whose strict discipline and impressive expertise reminded me of Commander Majok. Training under Marshall was exactly what I needed in my life. He was an Australian man whom I respected and didn't want to disappoint. That football training was a nice midpoint between military life and Australian life, and each session put a little bit more purpose into my life. After I started playing football, my TEF English studies went from strength to strength. I'd do all of my homework quite quickly, and then augment it with long hours of lying on the lounge room floor with little Joshua, watching the Wiggles. The Wiggles were of particular use for me. The slow cadence of their speech and the comic exaggeration they used helped me contextualize all the words they were using. Sometimes I found myself watching Josh's Wiggles DVDs without him. At football training, players would sometimes catch me singing Big Red Car or Hot Potato to myself and laugh. It was embarrassing, but I didn't care. Apart from football, the only thing I really cared about then was learning English. In retrospect, I should have cared more about the dedication and sacrifices that John had made. He had a plan for me, for Elizabeth, and for Joshua. But the fierce sense of independence that had been instilled in me over the war years made it difficult for me to respect John the way I should have. I should have cared more about John and Elizabeth, but I didn't let myself. I wouldn't let myself become soft and caring. I didn't yet value how good life was in Australia. Too much of the war was still in me, too much of the death wish. I found it hard to give thanks to John for taking me away from East Africa, and I'm sure a therapist worth their salt would suggest that I feared the attachment of family lest they judge or disappear. If I had recognized that, perhaps I might have recognized how difficult John was finding life in Australia. Instead, I saw him as a fixed position, the confident and driven man I had known back in Sudan, John and I bickered sometimes. We argued other times, and on rare occasions, we fought bitterly. On those occasions, Jeff and Margaret welcomed me into their house, giving me a meal and a bed for the night. Jeff was an excellent, patient teacher, and from him I learned a lot about language and the Australian way of life. When I was at home, I would consume the English language like fire does a dry tree. I'd sometimes do my TAFE homework 2 or 3 times, and after that I would read passages from the Bible and then recite them in long, fast, rote strings like a chant. I would stay awake as long as I could, mumbling those passages to myself, trying to stave off the nightmares. I thought the nightmares would become more infrequent the longer I was in Australia, but that wasn't the case. Soon, I managed to make my days so full I barely thought about Sudan, but at night I couldn't help but think about bombs and guns and dead bodies, especially when I fell asleep. The church people suggested I try counseling, and I did try one session, but very quickly I surmised that they couldn't do anything for me. I wasn't really ready to speak, nor was the counselor I spoke to equipped to help me with the kinds of things that I had done and seen. I knew it would be strong men like Jeff, Bob, and Marshall who were going to help assimilate me into modern life, not well-intentioned but painfully underprepared therapists. I remember an instance at one of those early church visits when Jeff gave me a $20 note. I asked what it was for, and he explained that the money was to go into my back pocket, not for fun or food, but for an occasion when it was actually needed. He said I would know that moment when it arrived. That occasion would come just a couple of weeks later, when I was attempting to catch the train for the first time. I had never seen a train before, let alone caught one, so I walked into Blacktown Station as confused as a puppy in a thunderstorm. I didn't really understand about timetables and tickets and routes. After some time, I figured out which train I wanted to take and when it was arriving. When the doors opened, I jumped on board without solving the ticket conundrum. A few stations later, a ticket inspector stopped me. When they started asking questions I couldn't understand, I started to think perhaps they would take me to jail or they may even send me back to Sudan. Eventually, I got them to call Jeff, and he explained my situation. When we got off, they showed me how to buy a ticket, which I did with the $20 Jeff had given me. Since then, I have always paid for whatever I am supposed to pay for. That moment felt like a cultural breakthrough. I wasn't admonished or beaten by the ticket inspectors who found me. I was helped, and I was proud when I managed to purchase my first train ticket. Baby steps, baby steps. The problem is, for every conundrum I solved, I found another. Even as my English improved quickly, everything about Australian life was still so confusing, from buying food in a supermarket to crossing a busy intersection. For the first few months in Australia, I lived a very cloistered life. The paths I took to TAFE, or my apartment, or to Jeff's, or to the fields where I played football were always the same because on the routes I took, people expected me. Blacktown is now quite flush with Sudanese people, but back then, seeing a boy of such dark skin was a novelty. I had been background noise in South Sudan, and I hated the surprise I saw in people's faces in Sydney. When I walked on the footpath, it felt like everyone stared and pointed and whispered. I was ill-prepared to be an anomaly. It was especially hard for me when I had to go into businesses owned by Arabic people, who I'd been taught my whole life were killers and the enemy. I'd feel their eyes burning into me with their stares. As far as I knew, There were only 2 other African families in Sydney then: a North Sudanese family who we had little in common with, and a Dinka family from the state of Bahr el Ghazal, who used to visit our apartment from time to time. Due to the rules of seniority, and because they had no children my age, it was really only John who spent time talking with that family. Then one day, I saw an African guy walking down the street in Blacktown. I cut across the road and intercepted him. "Deng Adut," I said, putting my hand out. "Lamin Koli," he replied, not at all taken aback by me being so forward. That was it. We were mates, and I have been close to Lamin from that day on. Lamin worked at Woolworths full-time and had his own apartment, so soon I spent more time with him than with John, Elizabeth, and Josh. Lamin and I usually watched the English Premier League, and he helped me with my English homework. My English was too limited for us to actually hold a conversation, but we appreciated each other's company enough that it didn't matter. We often used to speak to each other in gibberish, a mishmash of real words in many languages and made-up sounds, just to feel as though we were speaking like friends would. I used to devour those conversations of nonsense. I'd forgotten what it was like to have a contemporary. Over the next few weeks and months, we started to accumulate, usually at soccer matches, more and more disenfranchised African teenagers. There was Mckelvey, an Ethiopian, Aji, a Ghanaian, Joseph and Robert Awala, 2 South Sudanese brothers, and another South Sudanese teen named Richard Akonda, who'd been in Australia since the 1980s. We are all still friends today. Lamin's apartment almost ended up serving as a drop-in center for the African youth of Blacktown, and we spent hour upon hour there enjoying the company of people who understood us. Richard especially was a huge help for me. Not only was his English first class, he also spoke Juba Arabic, a language I'd picked up a lot of during the war. My English improved in leaps and bounds at that time, and having a place where I felt accepted also helped me emotionally. There was only one place we spent more time at than Lamin's apartment, and that was the soccer field at Blacktown's Workers' Club. If I wasn't sleeping or eating or studying, I was playing football at that field. At first, we played every day until sunset, but after we found the switch that turned on the floodlights, we played deep into the night. When we could literally play no more, we would head back to Lamin's apartment for a barbecue feast and long, involved discussions about the intricacies of the English language. Those African boys became the bedrock of my Australian life. People like Jeff and Bob were a godsend, but at some point you need contemporaries who understand your struggle because they are experiencing it too. Those boys were my African island and my first real comfort in Australia. But I knew that eventually I would have to swim out into the difficult waters away from that comfortable place if I was to make a life in Australia. All of us African boys knew that. We would need to make Australian friends, work in Australian workplaces, and have relationships with Australian women. My first relationship with an Australian girl was with a friend of a friend. Alison was lovely and compassionate, and she gave me faith that I would someday be able to articulate myself properly. At that stage, my English was still elementary, but Ali seemed to understand everything I was trying to tell her. The connection that we had was legitimate, and I started to believe that I could fit in. I wasn't a novelty to her. I was a person, and I loved her for that. Our relationship was intense, as most relationships are at that age, and that intensity peaked when Ali and I had a pregnancy scare. My initial reaction to this news was relief. When I'd been shot through the testicles, It wasn't a Western doctor who had treated me, but a rushed soldier doing combat triage. I had no idea if I would ever be able to get a woman pregnant. For any young man, that would be a concern, but for a Dinka teenager who had questioned the status of his manhood for some years, it was doubly so. In English, to have balls means to have masculine power. But in Dinka culture, testicles are not just the figurative center of manhood. They are the defining characteristic. After a certain age, there are no respectable Dinka men without children. In a situation where I should have been thinking of what Alison needed, I was only thinking of myself. Ali and I were just teenagers and both still in school, so I was ill-equipped to understand the emotional experience it would be for Alison if she was pregnant. I can't imagine how hard it would have been for an Australian girl to be with me at that time and to go through that ordeal. It all turned out okay, but that relationship didn't last. It started to disintegrate after the pregnancy. But I'm still friendly with Ali to this day and only think of her fondly. She was and is a compassionate person, and I only wish I could have been more compassionate myself when she needed me to be. At the time, though, I was confused and angered by the dissolution of that relationship, and I convinced myself that my lack of English was the primary issue. And not only that, I was sure that my ongoing confusion about Australian life was because of my language issues. I redoubled my language efforts, spending every moment with an English speaker or with a book in my hand. I found that picking up English words was not difficult, but turning them into sentences, into concepts and sense, took all of my concentration and patience, neither of which were traits I had brought with me to Australia. Learning English wasn't an impossible task, however, just a very difficult one. And thankfully, I had the help that I needed. I had my African friends. I had Josh and the Wiggles. I had Jeff, who would drive all of us African misfits to our football games while grilling me about verbs, nouns, and adjectives. If I had had an Australian godfather, it would have been Jeff. He took all the duties of a parent when a parent could not fulfill those duties, and he also led me to Christianity, a faith I dipped my toe into but never fully immersed myself. Although I really liked the morality and narratives of the Bible stories I read at night, I could never see them as anything more than just stories, as it had been in my village when John used to tell me about Christianity's big God and his son Jesus. He felt it, but it never felt real to me. John was devout, and you may imagine that his attachment to the church helped him integrate into Australian society, but it didn't. For all of us, it was hard, but for him, it was a particular shock. I don't know exactly the source of his discontent, but I think it was a mix of John losing the status that he had had in South Sudanese society, the general culture shock, and the struggle that he had with the English language. He came to Australia with a decent grasp of the language, but to start the university degree that he wished to obtain, he realized he would need a much greater knowledge of the language than the passable English that he had. Another reason that John couldn't comfortably live in Australia was because of Elizabeth. I don't know if their relationship issues were a byproduct of the other stresses in their lives or a multiplier of those issues, but they fought relentlessly almost from the day we got to Australia. I think the tension between them was partly the result of a schism between what the marital expectations are for the Dinka and what they are in Australia. I don't think either of them thought that their marriage should be wholly an Australian or Dinka union, but I also don't think they could ever agree where in the middle they should meet. John took all the measures he could to make life better for his family in those early years, though. He took on his own TAFE course that would not only teach him English, but potentially give him a tertiary entrance qualification, while also diligently fulfilling his caretaker position. But even when he was a student and a worker, he never really managed to feel comfortable in Australia. And he always talked about what life would be like when he had a good job and money flowing. When he finished his TAFE course, John quickly directed his attention to a university degree. John had always had a very rigid understanding of how the ladder of success in places like Australia was constructed. And, as far as he was concerned, the first and few rungs were educational. John was accepted to study social science at Western Sydney University. We were delighted for him, but not surprised. When John saw a path, he would move heaven and earth to make sure he could walk it. The path John saw for himself involved working on large international aid projects. He saw a middle-class dream in his future, but he would also never forget the African nightmare of his past. He couldn't forget how easily and cheaply lives could be improved in Sudan, and he wanted to be in a position to do just that, only not in Sudan, never in Sudan, and preferably not in Africa. John had always thought Africa would kill him if he returned. When news about the war in Sudan was available, often it wasn't, as it was a war that the West largely ignored despite its enormous loss of life. I'd barely pay attention. John, however, and his friends, the Sudanese refugee population in Australia was starting to grow, would endlessly chew like cow's cud information about the fighting and potential treaties and political machinations. John spoke of the war differently from the rest of the men, however. He didn't speak as though it was happening directly out the front of his door. John was always concerned about his family in South Sudan and our tribe, but he was only attentive to the SPLA plight as their fortunes related to the people he loved. For my part, those stories of treaties and alliances and international pressure meant almost nothing. I had never seen the war from the perspective of the eagle. I had only ever seen it through the eyes of the warthog. The war, for me, had only ever been visceral, never intellectual, and I was still largely divorced from my tribe and African family. The SPLA had seen to that. When Australian troops landed in East Timor in 1999, after the UN ordered an intervention, John started dreaming of working in what would soon be the world's newest nation. The similarities between East Timor and the southern Sudanese struggle were striking. From the yoke of oppressive Islamic hegemons to the questions of how a guerrilla force could become a legitimate government. First, however, he needed to complete his studies. John worked hard at university, but there were times when academic protocol confused him. I remember one instance when John submitted a major assignment about Dinka rituals for an anthropology class, only to be told he would have to cite his sources. That confused John. He had lived what he was writing about, but his tutor had told him his information would be discounted unless some old Kawaja author corroborated it. Those were the rules of the game, though, so John reached out to his friend Hugh Remington, an Australian journalist who had been welcomed by the Sudanese community after his excellent reporting of the war. Hugh found the book John needed in a Paddington second-hand bookstore. During his degree, John was offered a scholarship to study at the University of Geneva, and with Remington's help, he managed to take up the offer. John was overseas when Elizabeth gave birth to their second child, a girl. For that child, John chose a very Sudanese name, Gwet. It was the same name as one of our sisters. Once again, I was the first man to hold John's baby after she was born. I didn't really understand why John wanted to be away. I always thought he should have been home with his children. I knew far less about parenting than most, but I knew what it was to grow up without the love and care of my parents. John did too. He'd left for the army when he was only a few years older than me. So his decision to be often absent confused and angered me. In 2001, there was another sharp improvement in my English abilities, and that was the year I became confident conversing with strangers in English. I started to feel like I'd managed to tap into what I'd previously seen as the beguiling but impenetrable magic that was regular Australian life. The charms of a Western life were starting to reveal themselves. My mind would still go back to Africa in my nightmares, but when I was awake, I was concerned only with the English Premier League standings or when my mates were going to be heading to Lamin's place or what English homework I still had to do. Around that time, I got my first job, which was arranged by Jeff. It was a lawn mowing gig at a large house in Minchinbury, and my efforts paid me $20 at first, then $25, and finally $30, with my price having been renegotiated due to the extreme care I took in the presentation of that garden. Later that year, I did some modeling too, signing up with a multi-ethnic modeling agency called 7 Flavors, which helped me put a lot more than $20 in my pocket, and brought an African splash to advertisements for companies like KFC and Panasonic. Then again, with the help of Jeff, I got a job at a petrol station in Blacktown. As he drove me to the interview, Jeff explained to me that this would be the perfect job for me. Not only would it help with my conversational English, I could do all my shifts at night if I so chose. Jeff knew that I slept very little due to my ongoing nightmares. I landed the job, and Jeff bought me a second-hand push bike so I could get to and from the petrol station. The job did improve my English as I worked more and more shifts, but it also gave me more of an understanding of the complexity of Australian society. For the most part, people were respectful and friendly, but there were some people who were as furious and aggressive as some of the angrier soldiers I had met in Sudan. Once, while at work, I watched a motorcyclist try to douse another man with petrol during a heated argument. Both had expensive-looking vehicles, and I couldn't stop wondering why people so rich would ever bother trying to kill each other. I was robbed one night at work too. A gun was thrust in my face, not something I'd ever expected to have happen to me in Australia. It was quite late, maybe 2 or 3 a.m., and a drug addict wearing a hoodie busted into the station with a handgun and threatened me. He wanted the money from the till in front of me, which I gave to him. Then he wanted more money. He grabbed my tie, pointed the gun at my belly, and then screamed for me to get him the money from the second till. In my experience, if you point a weapon at someone, you are getting ready to commit murder. So I was convinced that this man was set to kill me once he had his money. The second till was heavy with coins, and when the man motioned for me to dump the coins into a cradle he'd made with both hands in his hoodie, I decided I would grab the gun after dumping the heavy coins into his shirt and shoot him dead. Then I looked hard at the handgun and saw that it wasn't even loaded. This man was committing a robbery with an unloaded gun. He was an idiot. What if I had a gun? I certainly would have killed him. I had no interest in a fist fight with a junkie over someone else's money, so I gave the man his meager spoils and let him leave. The man left with less than $300. I didn't understand why anyone would find themselves in so desperate a spot when living in a place like Australia. With a very small amount of effort, one could be paid nearly $300 every day without potentially being killed in the process. It made no sense to me. After that incident with the junkie, life went on normally for me, but for Cheryl, the shift manager, who had been in the back during the whole encounter, her mood had been permanently changed. She never came back to work, and I heard that she started having nightmares about that night. All that over $300 in small notes and change. It was during that period, while I was working at the petrol station, that I also first experienced the sharp sting of overt pointed racism. As many of the other African boys also worked at night and on weekends, our days off would often end up being during the week, and in spring and summer, we'd pile into a car or two and make the trek to Bondi Beach. One day, we parked a few streets away from the beach, and as we walked to the sand, an older white Australian man took it upon himself to start yelling at us. "Oi, oi, fucking go get a job," he yelled at us. We all had jobs. We ignored him. "Go get a job, go get a job, go get a job," he yelled, as though it was a mantra. "Just ignore him," Mckelvey said. He was often our voice of reason. Our refusal to engage with this man only angered him though. "Fucking lazy niggers," he spat. Niggers. The word didn't quite have the inherent power to hurt us as much as it would an African American, and initially I was more offended at being called lazy. But the tone in the man's voice as he said that last word, and his vitriol, stayed with me. We didn't have a confrontation with that man, but I began to think about that word. The intent of that word gave it power. Shortly after that trip to the beach, another man, an Asian man, started to throw that epithet at me when he saw me walking around Blacktown. This man used to chase me with it, splashing the poison of that word on my back as I walked around. I realized then that no matter how much work I did to become an Australian, there would be some people who would never accept me. Even if I assimilated in every way, the darkness of my skin would preclude me from being considered Australian by a select group of Australians. In my lighter moments, I recognized that it was only a small but uncomfortably loud section of Australians who thought that way. I knew that for every crazy old Bondi man, there were a dozen Jeff Hitchisons. But in my heavier moments, I started to wonder why I was working so hard on my studies, if I would always be defined by the darkness of my skin. In 2001, I finished my TAFE course and received a qualification that was the equivalent of a high school certificate. I could now start to think about further education and possibly even a vocation. I'd only ever thought about doing 3 things with my life: fighting, fishing, and raising cattle. But I knew I didn't want a career in Australia doing any of those things. The problem was, I didn't have any idea of what else I could do, except a secret vocational dream that seemed so preposterous that I'd not spoken to anyone about it. Then one day, an Italian friend from my football club told me that his son was about to enroll in a 1-year accounting course and that I would do well to do the same. I told him I thought it was unlikely that I'd be able to keep up with a course like that, but this friend promised that he and his son would help make sure that I passed. I had never even thought about accounting as a concept, let alone a career. I had almost no experience with mathematics. Apart from a little foundational stuff we did at TAFE, the extent of my math studies had been memorizing the multiplication tables that were printed on the workbooks that we were sometimes given when we studied English in Kakuma. Accounting, in principle, seemed to tick all of the boxes I wanted to tick in a career though. I wanted a job that was in an office, a regular job that would bring a regular wage. I was striving to get to Middle Australia, and there didn't seem to be anywhere closer to the middle than accounting. John had stressed that I should consider further study when I finished my TAFE course. When I told John about the accounting course and the friend at football who said he would help me, John unequivocally told me I should do the course. "It's with help that people like us will get ahead," John told me. "If help is there from someone you trust, you grab it with both hands. It was a very Sudanese way of looking at things, as it's through clan or tribal connections that almost everything gets done back in Sudan. I told John that I thought I didn't have the language skills or scholarly instinct to do accounting, but John didn't believe me on either account. The good thing about numbers is that they are the same in every language, and as far as you being a scholar, you won't have spent as much time in the classroom as the rest of the students, but I'd be surprised if they'd learned as much in their lives as you have. Also, your English is improving quickly, much faster than mine is. You always had an incredible brain for languages. John and I spoke as much English to each other as possible. But if something really needed to be said, we would speak in our mother language. So, this conversation, like all our serious conversations, was spoken in the Dinka language. John told me that he thought I would be a better student than him. I didn't believe that. John was a hustler, in the best sense of the word. He was relentless when he set his mind to something. He was not one to blow smoke up my ass, though, to use a recently acquired Australianism, and he wasn't going to have me commit to something he didn't think I could achieve. I enrolled in an advanced diploma in accounting the next day. It was an epochal time for both John and me. While I was starting my academic life, John was trying to begin his professional life. But even though he had climbed the academic rungs of his ladder, the professional footholds above him proved elusive. Despite being a man of incredible drive and intelligence who spoke 6 languages, John could find no work except in a factory in Penrith. With each shift in that job, John's incredible moxie started to erode. Ground down by life's unfairness, an unfairness he thought he'd escaped by coming to Australia. John never stopped trying though, attending meetings, sending resumes, and petitioning aid organizations. The offers eventually came in, but only for work in East Africa, where John feared to return. For my part, I threw myself into my accounting course and I found it close to being insurmountably difficult. True to his word though, my Italian friend and his son never let me get too far behind, taking me back to their place many nights after school and filling me with coffee and study until I had caught up. Even though I completed the course with moderate grades, I always suspected I would be a bad accountant. My suspicions were confirmed after Jeff helped me get a job in the accounting department of the Marist Brothers charity that had helped bring me to Australia. I tried hard in that job because I appreciated the opportunity to help an organization that had done so much for me, but there were never going to be any songs about my incredible book balancing. It just wasn't in my blood. I enjoyed having a full-time job and the pay that accompanied it, though. The rest of my African friends had started day jobs by then also, and we began going out regularly at night in the city and King's Cross. None of us boys who used to meet at Lamin's place were drinkers, but we enjoyed going to bars and clubs, meeting girls and dancing, like most other young Australian men. The word nigger was apparently even easier to unleash at night, and when we walked through the neon-lit Sydney streets, we'd hear it almost every night. Sometimes there were fights, often with groups of Middle Eastern men. I would have imagined there would have been a fraternal bond between us, as some of them most likely came to Australia because they or their parents were also escaping a war, but that wasn't the case. The fights didn't stop us from going out though. We weren't going to be chased away like that. There was conflict at home too. The relationship between Elizabeth and John was going from fractious to broken, in no small part because John was ill-equipped to raise his children. The axiom about it taking a village to raise a child was literally true in Dinka culture. but the men in the village only took a role when the children were older than Josh and Gwet were at that stage. Soon, the arguing between John and Elizabeth became intolerable for me. I sat down with John one evening and told him that I couldn't stand it anymore. You brought me to this country and you asked me to become soft so I could fit in. I was a soldier and you asked me to become a peaceful family man. I did that, I told John. Now you're smashing that peace and family into pieces. John didn't disagree with me. He knew his transition into Australian society hadn't been an easy one. But, as the older brother, he couldn't take a backward step either. He was prideful and he told me that if I wanted to leave his house, I was welcome to do so. At that stage, another family member had joined us. My uncle Philip Nwanakau, who had come to Australia as a refugee and was now studying for a bachelor's degree in engineering, which would eventually lead to a master's concentrating on irrigation. Mark cares about you, and he's worried about you, Philip told me when John and I had separated. All of our Sudanese family referred to John as Mark, his Sudanese name. I worry about you too. You go out too much, you spend too much time with your friends, and you don't seem happy. Neither you nor Mark seem happy. And that to me seems unnecessary. Philip had always been a wise one, even when I was back in my village. I'd look at him as an exemplar, no matter what the subject was. It was Philip who taught me how to bake the mud cows I loved to make in the sun, so they could take form and solidity and not crumble in my hands. I knew that John was unhappy, but I hadn't entertained the possibility that perhaps I wasn't happy either. I know in retrospect that I hadn't really been happy since I'd arrived in Australia. But I also knew that I had no problem being unhappy, as I'd not thought I should be happy. When we came to Australia, John stressed to us over and over that getting to Australia was just a beginning. He used to tell me that when I got to Australia, there would only be work ahead of me. And he was right. But talking to Philip, I realized there could potentially be something else for me. Perhaps it was time for me to think about what I actually wanted for my life. It seemed that for much of my life up until that point, I'd been subject to the volition of others, be they the SPLA or John. But maybe now it was time to think about what I actually wanted from this new Australian start. I thought and thought about it, and I only came up with two answers. The first was that I no longer wanted to live with John and Elizabeth. I loved both of them, and I loved Josh and Gwet too, but being in that house of perpetual discontent was poisoning me. I also decided that accounting would only ever be a job for me, not a career. It seemed the two realizations were at odds with each other. If I were to get my own place, I'd need money. But if I wanted to have money, I'd need to keep my job. Or perhaps I could take another job. I did just that. I quit my accounting job and took a position at the Red Lee Chicken Factory, taking chickens from their cages and putting them in trucks. All day, moving chooks from cage to truck. I preferred that work to accounting, even if I stank of chicken shit all the time, regardless of how much I scrubbed and how much deodorant I applied. I got my own place too, a tiny one-bedder in Blacktown, which was within cycling distance from the Red Leaf facility. Shortly after that, John left. The overseas contracts that he was being offered were too lucrative, and John desperately wanted to be able to make some money. The first position he took was in Somalia, but the second was in Sudan, working on a project just a few hundred kilometers west from where we were born. In that period, there had been a lull in the war, and both the SPLA and Sudanese government had gone back to the negotiating table. It was a time of rehabilitation and infrastructure building for Sudan. one of the first in some decades, but it was not exactly what you would call a time of peace. I thought John's decision to go back to Sudan was extremely irresponsible. Elizabeth thought the same, and threatened to leave John, but he could not be moved on the subject. Even now, I think John should have stayed in Australia, but I also have an adult's understanding of debt, opportunity, and responsibility, and I feel more strongly the pressures John must have felt when he made his decision. John's contract in Sudan was with Oxfam, working on a humanitarian project in the province of Bahr el Ghazal. There he had 3 resources in abundance that were greatly coveted: 4-wheel drives, diesel fuels, and cordon field radios. Of course, eventually an SPLA strongman came to John to relieve him of all 3, and John tried to explain that he couldn't simply let the SPLA have the fuel, cars, or radio, but that he and his team could bring much-needed food and agricultural supplies to the region. The deal was not amendable to the SPLA. They came back with soldiers, seized the cars, fuel, and radios, and beat John unconscious. When he came to, he was in a sheer-walled pit filled with human excrement in a military camp. There he wallowed and wasted for days before being transferred to an SPLA jail. I think the only thing that kept him from being killed was his Australian citizenship. It took some days for an Australian consular representative to be dispatched to save John. The Australian consulate in Nairobi initially tried to secure John's release remotely, but the SPLA would not even admit that he was in detention, and later, when there was no doubt where John was, they flatly refused the request, telling the consulate that John was South Sudanese, not Australian, and therefore subject to their total authority. Eventually, John was released, and soon was in an intensive care unit in Nairobi on the verge of death. When he was well enough to return to Sydney, he did so, and when I saw him, he looked like an old man. John had added to his old scars, with fractures of the head and facial lacerations, and was also suffering a malady that would change his whole life. During his time in that pit of shit, the skin condition John had suffered during the war, most likely a rare autoimmune disease, became far more acute. John's skin now cracked and fissured when he was in even mild cold, and he could not bear to be in air conditioning, let alone an Australian winter. John would now forever be tied to Africa, or that was at least the way John saw it. As broken and sick as he was when he came back, John was resolved to return to Sudan. I thought it seemed a suicidal impulse to go back, even in this time of relative peace. There were so many ways to die, even if John hadn't randomly fallen afoul of some of the more brutal elements of the SPLA. The people who would want to see John dead were gaining power in the SPLA. John had held some of the most sensitive information when he was a radio operator during the war. He had been a conduit between Dr. John Garang and his deputy Salva Kiir during the brutal height of the war, and it wasn't unusual for those who knew where bodies were buried to wind up dead themselves. Sudan was in John's blood though, literally and figuratively. Elizabeth was incandescently angry with John's decision. John told her she had no right to be, and that the wife's job was to care, and the man's job was to provide, wherever he could. I didn't stick around when they started tearing strips off each other again. I started to understand John's desire to return to Sudan. While in Australia, I'd become privy to information about the ways that my family had been targeted by certain parts of the SPLA. Family members had been routinely found dead if they had the audacity to gain an education or some significant status around Bo and Jonglei, and those killings were still happening. I thought it was an outrage, and seeing my brother broken and beaten did something to me. It made me want to go back to Sudan with John and try to protect our family, which John was trying to do now physically and financially. I'd not thought much about our family in Sudan before, but I started to think about them more around this time. I told John that one day I wanted to go back to Sudan and right all the wrongs that had been done to John and our family. "What does that mean?" John asked me. "Prosecute the people responsible if we can. And if and when we can't?" I just shrugged my shoulders. It was only a few years since I'd been in the army, and I thought that if those men were killed, then that would be a just outcome. John made me promise that I wouldn't return to Sudan. He told me that I was too outspoken, with too much of a black and white understanding of morality. He told me that my life wasn't in Sudan, like his had to be. Before the cold of winter could set in, John took another contract in Sudan and left us. Elizabeth had told John that she was finished with him. She'd met another Sudanese man who she would eventually have 2 children with. I think John's pride had been deeply bruised in Australia. But in Africa, I suspected he could feel like a man again. And that was probably doubly true when he found that Elizabeth was with another man. Eventually, John would have another Australian love too, Elizabeth's cousin, whom he had a child with. When Elizabeth heard about this child, her pride was at least equally hurt, and she foreswore that John would only be in her life as the father of her children. Some couples, however, are bound in a reason-defying way, and that was true of John and Elizabeth. They had another child in 2008, a girl they named Alwell. John was in Sudan when the Sudanese peace agreement was finally signed. In the years before the agreement, the pointless, bloody taking and retaking of places like Torit and Kapoita had stopped, and the South had settled into a state of restless stalemate. The SPLA had taken almost the entire south of Sudan, except some major population centers like Juba and Bor, which the northern-led government had to resupply from the air at great difficulty and expense. The SPLA was also operating in the north, in potential breakaway areas like the Nuba Mountains and the Blue Nile. The fighting in those areas threatened to open up again, a full-scale, multi-fronted war, and that was something the North wanted to avoid, if at all possible. After 22 years of constant war, in which an estimated 2 million people were killed, legal peace came to Sudan on January 9, 2005. The agreement stipulated that the North could not insist on Sharia law in the South, the root cause of the war, and that Khartoum would allow for a referendum on the potential independence of the South. The SPLA was to stop attacking the oil fields that would now benefit both North and South, and also demobilize all of their remaining child soldiers. Many of those soldiers were sent home, but many reported to barracks again a few weeks later. When I came to Australia, we were some of only a handful of Sudanese in Sydney, but by the time the peace agreement had been signed 6 years later, the refugee community had swollen. When the official reconciliation between North and South was announced, the Sudanese diaspora partied through the day and night across Western Sydney, from Sydney Olympic Park to Granville, and of course Blacktown, where the bulk of the Australian Sudanese had resettled. We danced, sang Sudanese songs, and played football, and I shared food and drink with Nua and Dinka alike, and even people from the north. I got home in the early hours of the morning, and as I lay in my bed, I wondered what a cessation in the fighting might mean for John and my mother. I also wondered if I would now be able to free myself from my nightmares. Of course, after a couple of hours of sleep, I was right back in Kapoita. waiting for bullets, artillery, and death to greet me. Chapter 8. Some to Justice, Some to Fate. After the peace was signed into law, many of the Sudanese who had run to Australia planned their return. The peace agreement stipulated that the South would have limited autonomy for 6 years, paving the way for a referendum on independence that was planned for 2011. In my lifetime, there had never been a time of hope in the south of Sudan like that time. John came back to Sydney after the peace agreement, but by then I realized he was not returning to us in a permanent way. "There will be a new country, Deng, and that will be my home," he said. I had mixed feelings about what John was doing. I understood his excitement about the possibility of the birth of this new country, and that he now felt fealty to our family in Sudan. But John had laid roots in Australia. He had a family here, children, and that meant he had responsibility. I was there for John's children, but I was not their father. I couldn't completely condemn him though. After all, he wasn't moving to the United States, but back to the villages of my youth to improve the war-ravaged lives of the people living there. And there were also many months that he couldn't live in Sydney anyway because of his skin condition. Before he left, I sought John out for advice. I had decided I wanted to apply for a course of university study, and as the graduate of an Australian university, I wanted to know which school John thought I should apply for. John told me that the answer would depend on what field of study I was looking to take on. I told John I wanted to study environmental science. It was a dream I'd harbored for years without ever admitting. The Nile River has been the wet center of my soul since I was born, and I thought about it often. During the war, I'd heard of a plan the North had to divert water through the Sud wetlands, a tributary of the Nile, back up to the north of Sudan and Egypt. The project, which was to be called the Jonglei Canal, would essentially end fishing and agriculture as many of us Dinka knew it. As I got older, I started to understand that that project would have been a cultural genocide for our people. The canal project was only abandoned when the war consumed the South, and I'm sure would have been resumed if the North had managed to destroy the SPLA. A giant abandoned French-made digger sitting out in the Jonglei swamps is all that remains of the project. But I often thought about what Sudan would have been like for a Dinka fisherman's son in a land with no access to fish or grazing ground for our cows. The canal was an omnipresent thought in my mind, even though I'd expunged most other thoughts of Africa. When I told John of my prospective field of study, he told me, in no uncertain terms, that it was something I should not dedicate years to. "The intention is right, but the execution isn't. Deng, people who make decisions about projects like the Jonglei Canal aren't environmental scientists," John said. "They are politicians or lawyers. I'd always seen you as a lawyer." "A lawyer? I couldn't handle being an accountant, and you think I could be a lawyer?" "I do. I've never met anyone as argumentative as you," he said with a chuckle. "Listen, you left the village when you were just a little boy, but you know all the ins and outs of Dinkabur law better than anyone." "That's just knowing the songs," I said. "Songs, books, what's the difference? What were your best courses when you studied accounting?" It was true that the courses I found easiest were those looking at taxation law. And when an environmental impact study is done on a project like the Jonglei Canal, who do you think uses that study to get a state like Sudan to act against their self-interest? Of course it is the lawyers, and only the lawyers. I'd never entertained the possibility of studying law, but while I'd lost respect for John in some ways, I'd gained respect for him in others. I knew he knew me better than anyone else in the world. Still, I didn't think I could study law, and when I told my friends, they agreed with me, laughing at the possibility. They thought perhaps I would be able to do law in 5 or 10 years' time, when my English had improved considerably. John said that my friends were just buying into a theme that some people in a position of privilege like to perpetuate, so people like me, people like us African kids, us kids from Western Sydney, don't come into their hallowed halls and take their desirable jobs. You are a hard worker, Deng. When you set your mind to doing something, you can do it, including this. That was perhaps the last advice I ever took from John, but it was the best and the most fruitful. I applied to study law at 3 universities, the University of New England, Western Sydney University, and Macquarie University. My hopes were hanging on Macquarie, as of the 3, it had the most prestigious law school. My preferences were confused, however, when one of Macquarie's law professors, Drew Fraser, wrote a letter to a newspaper suggesting that it would be a disaster admitting more Sudanese refugees into Australia because experience practically everywhere in the world shows us that an expanding black population is a surefire recipe for increases in crime, violence, and other social problems. Fraser's comments incited some media interest, and he used the platform not to back away from his statement, but to charge onwards, claiming that there was research that proves that black people have significantly lower IQs than white people, especially sub-Saharan African people like me. Professor Fraser's comment hurt me more than being called a nigger. This was a learned man, with sway in the community, not some bitter old man or a drunk kid on a bender. When Macquarie's acting vice-chancellor refused to condemn Fraser's views, instead citing academic freedoms as a defense for Fraser's comments, which would be undiscernible mixed in with lines from Mein Kampf, I resolved not to take up an offer of admission, should I get one from Macquarie, regardless of how it might look on a future CV. I ended up receiving offers from all 3 universities and immediately threw the offer from Macquarie in the bin. Such was my excitement at being offered a spot to study law at Western Sydney University that I barely even thought about the Macquarie offer until I told John about my multiple offers. "You will take up the Macquarie offer then, yes?" he asked. Absolutely not. He knew why too. I doubt there were any Sudanese who'd not heard about the comments and the university's response. "You will take that offer," John said, with anger in his voice, as though I was taking something away from him. He composed himself. "In a few years' time, this racism stuff will all be forgotten, and you will have a better degree than the one you would get at Western Sydney University." I won't have forgotten. Sometimes you have to compromise, Deng. That's the secret to life. I wasn't going to budge. If I were to be a lawyer, I planned to be a lawyer who was principled, not one who worked in margins of moral compromise. I couldn't start this new career by ignoring my disgust for racism and tribalism. The Macquarie conundrum made me realize that I'd learned a lot since I'd arrived in Australia. When I was a child in Sudan, I assumed that the Kawaja and the Arabs were all completely different species from my family and me. I even thought the Shilluk and the Nua and the Toposa were a different species from me. If I'd known anything about DNA, I would have assumed that theirs scaled differently, causing them to behave in a different fashion from me, eat differently, drink differently, hate differently, and love differently. It was that assumed difference that allowed me to be trained to kill them. I think the idea that people are inherently anything good, bad, violent, stupid, blessed, or expendable is the most dangerous idea in the world. I would not spend years on the campus of a university that didn't understand that. I also argued with John that accommodating racist ideas was to be intellectually bankrupt, so perhaps the Western Sydney University degree would be more worthwhile than a Macquarie University degree when I graduated. John was slowly but surely convinced, or at least he was convinced that I was not likely to budge. As I saw him relent, I thought to myself, perhaps I did have what it would take to become a lawyer. I accepted the offer from Western Sydney University, but that offer came with a caveat that it would be rescinded if I failed any of my core first-year units. I doubled up my English studies and engaged a private tutor in preparation for my first day at WSU. I stepped onto the campus still not knowing if I could complete my course. I would try though. I'd had another dramatic upswing in my English comprehension, but I still found some of the terms used in my first-year textbooks confounding, and law is almost all about careful reading. My boys initially thought my legal aspirations were a joke, but they supported me once the course began. I still saw the boys, but it was usually over the top of a textbook. I took my reading everywhere, on the bus and train, to dinners at Lamin's place, even to football practice, so I could read while I stretched. I took endless notes also, writing down any words or terms I didn't understand, making sure that I looked them up later and was able to use them correctly in future instances. I enjoyed law a lot. During my first year of study, it occurred to me that I had actually started life in a highly structured environment and was now returning to one. While the Dinka do not have a written legal canon, they were very rigid and adhered to laws regarding everything from murder and theft to property disputes and defamation. Even when looked at from afar, Dinka law is a beautiful thing, composed for the benefit of the land, the river, the cattle, and the people. Then there was the war. There was only one law in the war, and that law was that the war is bigger than you. The war saved almost no people, scorched the earth, scattered and killed the cattle, and poisoned the river. I was drunk on the law of the war when I came to Australia, but I sobered up as I learned more of the rules and language of the country that had welcomed me. As I started to learn the Australian laws, I found that they were like Dinka law, but instead of being in the service of the people and the land, it was in the service of people and of precedent. In that first year of law, the reading was extensive, the language often confusing and arcane, and there were few nights where my eyes didn't ache at the end of all the reading, but Australian law made sense to me, from intent to application. I passed all my core classes in the first year of my studies, allowing me to continue with my degree, but I did fail a law foundation class. The failure stemmed from my refusal to back away from an ethical stance I took in class. A brilliant academic named Dr. Mckelvey, who was well known in Australian socialist circles and contributed readily and intelligently to socialist journals, conducted the class and posed this theoretical problem to us. A bomb has been placed in a passenger jet with 200 people on board. It's primed to explode shortly. A suspect has been found, but he's not cooperating with the police. How far outside of the bounds of Australian law can you morally operate with this suspect? The opinion of the room was the opinion that was obviously sought by Dr. Head. There is no wiggle room. The law is the law. I had another, dissenting view. I would torture him, I told Dr. Head. How can you be sure you have the right man? And even then, how would you know that the information was right? My tutor asked. I know that people lie when under extreme duress. I have tortured and I have been tortured, but it would be worth the chance that you may get some information that could save the people on that flight. That answer is categorically wrong, Deng. I'm sorry. Dr. Head explained his reasoning. The law has to be allowed to be imperfect in singular situations. It moves and bends over time, but it does not break. Do you understand? Dr. Head asked. I do, but I would still torture this man, and I would also torture his family if it was needed. I was starting to believe in human rights, but I believed in a utilitarian version of human rights. I believed in the golden mean, the greatest good for the greatest number. I would not be budged. The argument continued throughout the course. Both Dr. Head and I thought we were arguing to the benefit of the greatest good for the greatest number, and I made impassioned but brutal arguments. I was only a handful of years removed from my time in the military, and not just a military, but one of the most ruthless militaries in the world. Arguments of bombs and death were not abstract for me. While we were debating theoretical aviation death in Australia, the real thing was happening in South Sudan. In my first year of university, Dr. John Garang, who was the head of state in waiting, died along with 6 colleagues and 7 crew members when his helicopter crashed flying between Uganda and Sudan in the middle of 2005. Officially, Garang died due to pilot error and poor weather, but many believe he was murdered, including his wife, Rebecca Garang, who said while giving a speech in 2007, "When my husband died, I did not come out openly and say he was killed because I knew the consequences. At the back of my mind, I knew my husband had been assassinated. If Garang was killed, then who killed him?" The list of possible assassins is a long one, from the Sudanese government, which Garang was the vice president of, to Joseph Kony's Lord's Resistance Army, which had a heavy presence in the area where the helicopter went down, to myriad SPLA actors, be they Nua or Dinka. Garang was both beloved and contentious. He was a gregarious, intelligent leader, and he was also my ideological North Star for the first half of my life. But he was also a man whose face I saw when I had nightmares in which men were executed in front of me. Garang's family tortured mine too, and that was something I thought about every time I saw John's scars or when he struggled to get out of a chair. I had very mixed feelings about Dr. Garang, and those feelings bubbled and boiled when I heard about his death. Still, there was too much of the SPLA in me to say that I wouldn't have approved the torture of whomever it was that killed him, if he was indeed murdered. I failed that ethics course. I recognize now that my arguments must have been jarring in peaceful Australia, but I would also argue that the course was always going to be a little harder for me than the other people in that class. A German military strategist once said that no battle plan survives contact with the enemy, and I would say that's true of a completely conventional understanding of ethics and morality. I passed the rest of my first-year courses, however, and I was off to my second year of studies. Then things became even more difficult, as the coursework became more voluminous and complex. I fell behind and started filing assignments late. I may have dropped out except that the Dean and Deputy Dean of the law school, Professor Michael Adams and Dr. Stephen Janes, took a personal interest in me and helped me immensely. They recognized that I was working hard, but that the cards were stacked against me somewhat, with my English still a work in progress and the academic rigor of a law degree a relatively new concept to me. They gave me no special treatment, but they monitored my progress, giving me a gentle push when it looked like I was going to fall too far behind. With those great men taking a personal interest in me, I thought it would have been a great dishonor to fail in my studies, so I redoubled my efforts. I knew that the semesters were only going to become increasingly difficult and that things would have to change if I was to graduate. I decided I was going to return to the attitude I had as a boy soldier. When I was in the SPLA, I would set a detailed plan for what I was going to do that day as soon as I woke. That was the only way to survive. I started doing the same thing at university. In the army, there was never any food during the day, so I decided to stop eating at the campus. We slept very little when we were in the army too, so I started to go to bed very late and woke very early. That last measure actually helped me become more rested, because when I was extremely fatigued, I found I had far fewer nightmares. The only activity I routinely kept up while at WSU was football, which was also something I'd done in the army. I played football and studied and attended lectures and had time with Elizabeth and the kids, and that was the whole sum of my life. Then one day, I finished my degree. As the graduation came closer and closer, I actually believed less and less that I would be handed a degree. I never thought gaining a law degree could be possible, even as I was picking up my gown and mortarboard. John had thought it possible, but I never really believed him. I had still seen myself as the grubby-faced child I'd been, with an AK-47 in his hands and death in his core, even as I progressed through year after year of law. I spoke to John every week while studying, and at times of particular stress, I would call him every day. He was a calming presence on the phone. He hadn't been when I was living with him, but things were different after he moved permanently back to South Sudan. I could never respect his decision to permanently move away from his children, but he was certainly more at peace in Africa and more himself. John flew back to Australia for my graduation and was incandescently happy when I was handed my degree. There were so many gates to that moment that I wouldn't have been able to get through without John's help. None of it would have been possible without him. I told him that night that, even though he had mostly been in Africa while I was studying, I wouldn't have been able to get the degree without him. He was so proud. There were all kinds of friends and family at the graduation. After the ceremony, we went to a church in Blacktown for a party of Dinka music and Sudanese food. People gave speeches too, and there was even one from James Mading Mabil, my sometimes harsh, sometimes angelic squad leader from the war. He now lived in Sydney too, and I was very happy that I could share my triumphant moment with him. Seeing so many people from my youth, I started to think about home. I was keen to start my career, but I was also, for the first time, yearning to go back to my village. I'd been asking John a lot of questions about home before my graduation, and I told him I was thinking about returning to South Sudan. Once again, he told me, in no uncertain terms, not to return. Your sun is rising now, Deng, and you must start work. We are technically a country in peace, but there is still danger. When you are established and the guns have been put away, that will be the time. Then I would be grey and old, if such a time comes at all, I laughed. The South Sudanese would usually not dare to talk about a time when the guns had been stored. There had always been a violent struggle for power within the SPLA, which had only been amplified with a whole nation's worth of resources and power up for grabs while the framework of independence and statehood was being established. By the time of my graduation, most South Sudanese people believed that two contentious, powerful leaders, Riek Machar and Salva Kiir, would lead the country into another civil war, with the dividing line being roughly drawn between the Dinka tribe and the Nuer tribe. Machar, the commander of the SPLA breakaway group that had killed so many in Bor during the war, had become the vice president of South Sudan. And when he had ordered that the supposedly magical Deng, a rod belonging to the Nuer prophet Nang Bong, be returned from London to Juba and started holding it aloft like Moses, we knew he was not going to be happy with his station as vice president. The Dang was a powerful, magical item in the eyes of the Nuer. Made of tamarind wood and copper, the 3-foot rod had been the prized possession of Nang Bong, and its potency was intertwined with the prophet's most famous proclamation, that a left-handed Nuer would best a bearded man in a war that would allow a new nation to rise. Machar was left-handed. The new president, Salva Kiir, was bearded, unusual for a South Sudanese man. The symbolism of the return of the Dang was obvious. I knew the danger, but I still wanted to visit. I had started to think more and more about my mother. For a long time, I'd managed to expunge thoughts of Athiak Deng, safe in the knowledge that she had a large family to look after. But now, I started to entertain the possibility of a return. I wanted to see John as well. John was only prone to self-promotion when it was needed, and so I had heard only a small part of his African story, which I understood was one of success. I knew that John had co-founded an NGO that aimed to help eradicate disease from southern Sudanese cattle herds, but he also had a number of other businesses including a hotel, a small airline, and a 4-wheel drive importation business. John was far from the only person from my tribe who had returned from Australia educated and activated, pouring their new skills into the maw of a new nation forged by war. Perhaps I could help too, and also be reunited with my mother and brother. As we spoke further, John became more adamant that I should not return. In fact, he strictly forbade it. He said that I had momentum now in Australia and that I must continue with work or further studies. He said it over and over, and I knew he was right. But once the possibility of a return became an idea in my mind, it only grew. After graduating, I picked up a job as a lawyer at a firm called Grace Legal, and instantly I liked the day-to-day work. Each case was both technical and human, and in each instance, resolution changed lives. I was often helping people, first-generation Australians, in legal cases, and it was rewarding work. I hadn't been a natural student, but practicing law was something I truly loved. I couldn't, however, stop thinking about South Sudan, and my mom and John, and how I might be able to help there. In 2011, I arranged to take leave, and I bought a ticket to Juba. My flight went through Dubai, and it was only at that airport that I told John or anyone in South Sudan that I was coming. He was at the airport to pick me up and gently berated me before giving me a warm welcome. "Welcome home, little swallow." Although he never said it, I think John appreciated being able to show me what he'd managed to build. In Australia, John had always been behind the financial 8-ball, despite being a naturally industrious and hardworking man. Often, while he was studying, John had to resort to Centrelink payments to feed his children, and getting handouts made him ornery and disoriented. It was so far from what he had planned while he dreamed in Kakuma. In South Sudan, he was the owner or co-owner of a number of thriving businesses, including a brick-making business that could barely keep up with the reconstructive environment that was post-war Juba. I had had my problems with John, combining the resentment a teenager can have for both a father and a brother, but I had always loved him, and I was buoyed to see him the successful man he was always destined to be, but somehow couldn't be in Australia. I worked with John for a little while, helping put together a tally of his assets and mediating in a minor industrial matter between his brick-making business and its workers. I'll never forget that time. John wore success very well. It matched his personality. For a little while, I even stopped getting on his case about his children, which was always the main point of disagreement between us. Part of me also enjoyed seeing the independent South Sudanese flag flying high across the capital, and seeing jeep-bound SPLA soldiers crisscrossing the city with impunity. Only part of me, mind you. I still couldn't fully get behind the idea that what had been done to win the war was completely justified, and the air of militarized paranoia that lingered in Juba was disconcerting for someone who'd spent so much time in Australia. After a little time in Juba, I left John, who was then working 7 days a week, and flew to Bo, and onward to my village and my mother. Both time and the war had aged my mother, but she was undeniably the incredible woman who had reluctantly sent me off to war with a package of food more than 20 years earlier. She greeted me with a hug, and we wept. There was still such a familiarity in her touch and voice and smile. It was in my DNA. We had so much to catch up on. I wanted to know about her life, but she said that little else but war had happened to her, and she didn't want to talk about that. I told her about my life in Australia, and my work, and studies, and the law. I stayed in the village for a couple of weeks and quickly realized how attached I had become to the ease of Western life. I struggled without electricity or running water and an actual bed. I wondered if I could ever live the village life again, and if I could ever marry traditionally. I'd always assumed I could, but with each day in the dust, I started to wonder. The real shock in that first trip, though, was how few people from my childhood remained in the village. So many had been killed in the war and the massacres, and so many more had been scattered within or outside Sudan's borders. I asked my mother about what happened to her when the Nua attacked Bor in 1991, the main incident that led to the villages feeling so empty. She said she didn't want to talk about it, but near the end of my trip, she said that I should probably know some details and how she got away. A niece of mine named Both Anyagat had led my mother across the Nile to the swampy east bank during the fighting. Both means leftovers in Dinka, and Anyagat means traitor. She had been named so because at that stage almost every other child had been sent away to fight in the war, or had run away, or had been killed. Across the river, a tribe of marsh dwellers and fishermen called the Dinka Aliab sheltered my mother. The Nua were skilled warriors, but they were not adept at marine combat, and my mother stayed safe with the Dinka Aliab until she received word she could return to our bank. There she found the village and the whole region littered with the dead. Most of the dead had been killed by machetes or spears. All had been left to rot where they had been massacred. The few men and boys who were not off in the war had been left to try to defend the villages. So it was the women and girls, like my mother and Both Anyagat, who were left to dig and fill the graves. While I was staying in the village, I was shocked at how alone my mother was. My youngest brother, Akao, had just joined the army, and although she'd birthed a considerable brood, she now only had grandchildren to look after her. I asked her if she would ever consider coming to Australia, but she said moving would be impossible for her. "I'm an old woman now," she said, "and I've lived my entire life here. I'll die here also. I'm at that stage in life." On my way back to Australia, I stopped off in Juba and spoke to John about my mom. I told John that I was considering getting a job in Bor so that I could look after her. "Village life isn't easy, but it's the life she's chosen, Deng," John told me. "I think you should do what she wants you to do. She wants you to go back to Australia and make something of yourself." I knew that was what she wanted. While I was with her, Mom had often complained that she was still alive while so many of the younger generation were dead. She said it was unnatural. I calmed her by telling her that nothing was going to happen to me in Australia. I had been sending money home for years, but I wondered if that was enough. I spoke to John about the possibility of Mom moving to Australia. He just laughed. "Did you talk to her about it?" he asked. I nodded. "And what did she say?" "Deng, you need to respect her wishes." He was right. John was a young man when he came to Australia, and the difference in the way of life was almost too shocking even for him. My mother had lived her whole life in a tiny, remote African village. She refused to relocate to Juba, just 200 kilometers south, so she was not going to live in Australia, which was culturally and geographically a world away. I realized I couldn't compare her life to mine, and that I shouldn't apply my understanding of quality of life to hers. Part of the reason I was so concerned about my mother was the feeling of unease in the South Sudanese capital. There were more guns in Juba and more nervous looks. there were matters about blood feuds everywhere and tribal discontent. It felt to me as though the capital was like an upset stomach, ready to let loose something vile. I returned to Sydney, but resolved I would go back to see my mother again, and soon. While I worked, I looked into master's courses that I might do, but I thought more and more about John and my mother and the new nation that was precariously positioned between the hill of reconstruction and the precipice of war. My thoughts about South Sudan also made me think more about the plight of African refugees. Even though I had been a refugee myself, both John and I were dedicated solely to the progression of our own lives and were not particularly involved in the plight of other refugees. Now I was in a position to help, so I started to feel as though I should. I took on as much pro bono work as I could, finding it especially difficult to turn down work representing South Sudanese men and women. Later that year, I was delighted and shocked to learn that I'd been nominated for the New South Wales Law Society Justice Medal. I returned to South Sudan again in 2012, once again against John's wishes. Once again, when I arrived in Juba, John admonished me briefly and then greeted me warmly. Before I'd left Australia, I'd been thinking a lot about whether a man as African as me could ever be accepted in Australia, and more specifically in the legal profession. Yes, there were many kind people who had not only accepted me but helped me in my career, but there were also some, and at the highest level too, who saw me as somewhat inferior because of my skin and accent. Before I had left for South Sudan, I'd been pulled over in my car for no other reason than I was black, having to prove to a policeman that I owned the vehicle I was driving, and I'd also been sanctioned for purportedly offending a magistrate when I knew my behavior was completely in line with normal transactional court conversation. It was strange, but at the point where I was starting to get all that I'd worked for, I was beginning to wonder whether I actually belonged in the country that I lived in or in the country that I'd fought for. Even just a couple of years after independence, it was obvious that South Sudan was not going to be the shining example of Christian African excellence that George W. Bush and the American right, great champions of South Sudanese independence, hoped it would be. But even though it was dangerous and likely to become more dangerous, in many ways it felt like home, especially during that second trip. On that trip, I was far more comfortable with village life. I fished every day on the Nile while I was up in the villages and spent lots of time at the cattle camps. I was honored when a bull was slaughtered so we could feast and celebrate my return. I was seduced by South Sudan, by the music I heard as I went past villages, the ease of speaking my native languages, and the smell of the river. Yes, you could feel danger in South Sudan, but you could also feel hope. I spent some time in Bor, which was the capital of Jonglei State, and where a number of my family members had taken up government positions. That's where I thought I might be best used, if I were to pick up a job in South Sudan. As a new nation that was as much argued into existence by the UN and US as it was fought for by the SPLA, aid money gushed into South Sudan after independence. Traveling around the nation, however, there was very little evidence of any of the money leaving the capital. In Juba, I had seen fleets of white Land Rovers zipping around, deploying Kawaja here and there. But in Bor, there wasn't even one paved road. In fact, there were no paved roads anywhere in South Sudan except the capital. I wanted to deliver a gift to the governor of Jonglei, Kwol Manyakjuk, a towering figure in the war. He was the commander of the SPLA forces in Torit. But before that, he had held overall command of the areas around Bor in the 1980s. In fact, the ribbon of boys that took me away from my home was designed by Kwol Manyang. I was related to Kwol Manyang, but despite that fact, he had most likely ordered the death of more of my family members than anyone else. He was known for being ruthless in battle and just as ruthless when maintaining discipline in peacetime. Throughout the country, he was regarded as a viciously effective general, and, for those so bold, he was also known as being passionately bloodthirsty. Executions were common under Kuo Manyang's command, and family or tribal connections would rarely help you escape a firing squad bullet if you crossed him. He was a brutal man for a brutal season. I hoped that the season was changing and that the man could change too. I had bought a gorgeous limited edition Cartier pen before leaving Sydney and wanted to give it to Kuo Manyang in person and tell him that I hoped in the future he would have more call to use it than his gun. A visit was arranged through family intermediaries, and I traveled to the governor's compound with my uncle, Philip Nyongakau, who had completed his engineering master's in Australia and was back in South Sudan. He was hoping to help with some reconstruction projects near our village, and while we were waiting to meet with Kuo Manyang, we sat with a group of men who included Mayengo, the State Minister for Agriculture, a man who I remembered from Pinudo, where he had also been in charge of agriculture for a while. I remembered him being a man of hustle and machination, but little skill and knowledge. I'm sure that part of the reason there was so little food in the camp at Pinudo was due to his incompetence. I vividly remember him ordering seeds be planted on ground that even I, an uneducated child, knew was barren. He and Philip eventually started a conversation about irrigation, and soon Mayen was out of his depth. The minister resorted to an oft-heard defense in South Sudan. That's the problem with this country. Foreigners coming to this country with Western educations with little understanding of how our country really works. The men within earshot who were sitting around idly playing dominoes agreed emphatically. The suggestion that men like my uncle and me, who had both fought for the SPLA, were foreigners stung bitterly. I also couldn't believe that these men couldn't recognize that an influx of foreign-found skills would be useful to the nation. I said nothing at the time, but I have thought of that offhand comment often since. When I met with Kuo Manyang, he was happy to receive as fine a pen as the one I gave him, but he said he thought it was not yet time for him to replace his weapon. He said his gun was a part of him, and that, as a former soldier, I should know that as well as anyone. Before my visit to the governor's office, I had been seriously considering moving back to South Sudan, but the visit gave me an understanding of the difficulties that I would meet daily. When I told John about the meeting, he just laughed. I tried to tell you, Deng, you've become too used to the fairness and equality of Australia and Australians. I am proud that you have, but it would make it hard for you to live here. He was right. When a situation deviated from that fairness, then it would put me out of kilter until I'd managed to rectify it, and unfairness would be something I would be dealing with daily in South Sudan and would just have to accept. When I returned home to Sydney, I threw myself into my work. I decided to take on both the University of New South Wales and the University of Wollongong masters that I was offered, as well as taking on a substantial caseload at my new firm, Ellen Legal. I also kept up with my pro bono work twice a week, and then, about halfway through 2013, I became even busier after meeting a man named Joe Corey while defending a South Sudanese man in an aggravated assault case. The South Sudanese man came to me after he had been arrested when a fight had broken out during a football game. Weapons had been used in the fight, specifically a crowbar and screwdrivers, and my client was one of 9 African men who were charged uniformly by police after the incident. The group had been charged en masse with rioting. The men were all looking at a short custodial sentence and a criminal record. Most of the charged men chose to take on the suggested pleas of guilty as offered by the police prosecution and wear the sanction that would come. My client, however, thought he was not as culpable as some of the other men in the group. The more I looked into the case, the more it seemed to me that the police had picked the not uncommon narrative of a bunch of crazy black men went crazy, instead of taking the time to look at the individual actions and responsibilities of the 9 different human beings involved in the incident. Too often, those outside Africa group Africans collectively without considering the individuals in a group. On a macro level, when considering something like a war or pandemic, it's important to keep in mind that every person who died did so after a unique and monumental losing battle, resulting in inimitable grief. It's also important to keep in mind that on a micro level, say after a football brawl, each person involved had their own motivation, fears, and culpability. After doing my research into the football fight, I found that there was an instigator, an aggressor, and an escalator, and that probably my client was none of those things. At court, I approached the police prosecutor and indicated as such. I requested that my client be subject only to the affray charge, with amended facts, and after much convincing, he eventually agreed. Then we moved to my favorite part of proceedings, the striking off of unfounded charges. In the last few years, I've picked up something of a weakness for expensive pens, but my favorite writing implement is the thick black texter I keep in my inside pocket when going to court. I pulled it out and started to whittle down the charges that had been leveled at my client, but had not been proven. Line after line of culpability disappeared under my ink, and with it money and time that my client would have owed the state. It was, and still is, an indescribably wonderful feeling. When I was finished, a few sporadic lines of the original charge sheet remained. It was then that I noticed the lawyer of the only other co-accused who had not taken the original Crown offer. This lawyer's name was Joe Corey, a kind-looking and energetic young lawyer of Lebanese descent who had been retained by one of the other defendants. Joe had done almost exactly the same redacting job that I had. I held up my charge sheet and we shared a smile and a moment of mutual satisfaction. Having negotiated the charges, it was now time to present our evidence to the court. Joe argued to the court that just because all of the men in the brawl had a similar skin tone, that didn't mean they were all similarly culpable. Joe claimed that while his client had helped instigate the initial fracas, which almost anyone who'd played sport would probably be familiar with, the violence that necessitated these legal proceedings was a shock to his client, and that his client had indeed been a victim of it. Corey had taken the time to break down, from moment to moment, what happened on the day of the brawl and argued that his client should not be sentenced to imprisonment. I could tell that Joe was looking for a similar outcome to the one I was looking for. I wasn't trying to have my client completely exonerated. I thought there was no getting away from the affray charges, but I didn't think he deserved to go to jail either. Before I started law school, I held a Pollyanna-ish assumption that everyone in Australia gets the legal defense they deserve. After a few years of working in the profession, I knew that that assumption was unfounded. I could see no holes in Joe's defense of his client though, just rigorous and complete reason. I was impressed. My submissions were eerily similar. My client ended up receiving only a Section 10 dismissal, bond, which meant that although they were found guilty, they wouldn't have a criminal record. Joe's client received a community service order, an outstanding result. It was undoubtedly a winning outcome for both of us. Ironically, our clients were on opposing sides of the affray. That evening, Joe and I met over a few beers. Eventually, the conversation moved to the paths that we saw ourselves taking in the law business. I saw myself becoming a barrister. It was something that my boss, Lyndon Nguyen, wished for me and had said he would help me achieve. Joe said he saw himself setting up his own practice. "I've just been waiting to find the right partner," he said, clinking my glass. I met the chairs and took a sip of my beer. "So, what do you think?" he asked. "Of what?" I was a little slow on the uptake. Joe laughed. "Well, would you consider looking into the possibility of becoming partners?" Setting up a practice wasn't something I'd ever thought about until Joe asked. As soon as he did, though, I instinctively knew it was the right thing to do. I agreed there and then to consider looking into the possibility. A few months later, AC, or Adut Law Group hung out its first shingle in Blacktown. When I made the decision to set up shop with Joe, I thought my boss at the time, Lyndon Nguyen, would be happy for me. We'd worked from a place of mutual respect, Lyndon and me. He had taken me on as something of a protege, and had often said that he would help me go to the bar when I'd finished my studies. For my part, I was in awe of his ability to negotiate, medicate, and represent. I was really looking forward to announcing to Lyndon that I would be setting up my own business, but I didn't want to tell him until all the setup was complete. So Joe and I worked nights and weekends, getting the preparatory work done, and I said nothing to Lyndon. I didn't approach Lyndon until Joe and I had registered our business, found an office, and even started hiring staff. When I announced my news, Lyndon's response was not what I expected. In fact, you rarely see a response so far away from what was expected outside of a cheesy situation comedy. Lyndon was angry, and as he explained why, I became more and more furious with myself. Of course he wasn't going to be happy for me. "Why didn't you tell me when you first started thinking about this stuff?" "Because I wanted it to be a surprise." "A surprise? Deng, I'm trying to run a business here. You think businesses like surprises like this?" I hadn't even for a moment entertained the possibility of Lyndon being upset. But now, I can't believe I'd been so stupid. Of course, he and Ellen Legal weren't simply there to help me achieve my goals. That was a fact that I completely missed. I'd had to work so hard to get where I was. I had sometimes missed the fact that everybody else struggled too. It was an important realization. Nobody gave Lyndon anything, and to suggest that he should be happy for me when my triumphs would adversely affect his business, a business that paid me no less, was absurd. That was something that I recognized too late. I apologized emphatically, but the damage was done. Lyndon forgave me and even sent some business to AC Law Group. But his wife didn't forgive so quickly. I can understand both decisions. After leaving Ellen Legal, I had some of the busiest months of my life. I didn't want to cease any of my activities, but it was necessary while Joe and I set up our law firm. I couldn't keep up with 2 postgraduate courses, pro bono work, and my paid work. So I quit the UNSW Masters. All the while, back in South Sudan, the pot of discontent was bubbling, fit to spill into war. My conversations with John were never explicit in regards to politics and military machinations, as we all suspected that the CID, South Sudan's secret police, was listening to many of his conversations. But even in his vanilla explanations of what was happening, I could glean the stress and pressure of upcoming conflict. The stress for John rose when Elizabeth turned up in Juba in September 2013, calling for John and some of his family members to meet with her and her family so their marriage could be traditionally and permanently dissolved. They all assembled in a large meeting room in Juba, with John and his representatives on one side and Elizabeth and hers on the other. Elizabeth spoke first, explaining why she thought she should be granted the dissolution. She said that John fulfilled none of the obligations of a husband and very few of those of a father. Elizabeth explained that both she and John had had children to other people, and say that she was a wife in name only. She said that her dowry, which was to have been 36 cows, had never been paid. Her argument was compelling. John, normally an excellent negotiator, responded only with this: "I want you back." He didn't respond to any of Elizabeth's claims,